Okay, so I think that I've got the microphone working. I'm just gonna turn down a little bit of the volume. Hopefully that's a bit better, so that everybody can hear me all right. In fact, we'll turn it almost all the way down. Just gonna play a little bit of Elden Ring. Just for fun, while we answer a couple questions. Get this party started. So, any questions that you guys have about Cult of the Maw, or about the world, or about, just anything that is happening with that series, um, now is your chance to ask me, and I will do everything I can to answer those questions to the best of my ability, which should be a lot of ability considering I made up the series. It's my series. So I guess that's the first thing that people should know is that Cult of the Maw is completely original. It's not based off of like a game book or any other established fiction. The world, the history of that world, and all the characters, those are all original. I created them. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. It's all just from my brain. I don't know how else to put it. Don't pay any attention to the character I'm making. It doesn't matter. That's not what we're here for. Um, it may take a little bit for people to notice that, um, you know, that I'm streaming this, but I did let folks know ahead of time, so hopefully some folks will show up with a couple of questions for me. I would assume. Until then, I don't really have a lot else to add, so I guess we'll just play some Elden Ring and hope that things progress from there. Oh, okay, we've got a question. Tell us about the Iron Hand. Oh, okay. That's actually a little bit spoilery if we get into spoiler territory. But yeah, sure. We'll talk a little bit about the Iron Hand a little further on. I know I've been kind of teasing his existence throughout the past couple of chapters of Cult of the Maw that you guys have had access to. Um, I've made a couple of references to the Iron Hand, to what he's about, as well as to the Black Sires, to Ratenwick, and the One. So you know what? In terms of lore dumping, I'm going to start at the very, 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 very beginning, just to give you an idea of what it is that we are working with. So bear with me one second. I'm going to open up my notes because I don't want to do this from memory. Um, I've been working on Cult of the Maw and the World Carver universe for a couple of years now, and I have, you know, pages upon pages upon pages of notes, all dedicated to creating um, this universe. So, and we're not talking about just a self-contained story in Cult of the Maw. No, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years of history, practically like its own. I don't want to hype it up too much and call it its own Silmarillion, but um, I'm hoping to reach that kind of level before I die. And there are several other pieces of history that I want to delve into, not just in this stream, but in terms of creating content. Like Cult of the Maw is a story that takes place in this universe, but there are so many other stories to tell. Um, and I would absolutely love it if other people would start writing their own stories in this universe, later on. Once I've kind of established that we're not going to win this fight, so I'm just going to jump off the cliff. I don't know. It would be fantastic to me for other people to create their own stories in this universe after I've established more of the canon. Um, but we'll start from the very beginning. So there are several mentions in the first couple of chapters of someone called just the One, and I'm not talking about Neo from the Matrix. Hold on one second while I double check and make sure that my audio is coming through so that this stream isn't just trash. Bear with me one second. Very, 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 very beginning. Okay, yes, it is coming through. Everyone can hear me, if there was anyone here to hear me. Yeah, so we'll start by talking about the One and who the One is and what the One is all about. Um, I will get to the Iron Hand. We're going to get there when we talk more about the Second Age and the Second War of Wrath. Those words mean nothing to any of you yet, but we're going to get there. I swear it. I promise you, we're going to get to a point where those things matter. But we'll start with the very beginning with the One. Um, it's pretty obvious that that's in reference to a creator deity or god. Um, I feel like I've been quite explicit in the imagery, um, but there's no pantheon of gods that the people in this world believe in. Um, there's just the one, and it's very difficult for them to have any other faiths or any other religions that don't stem from the one. There's definitely multiple sects, like multiple different disciplines or cults involved with worshiping the one in their own separate ways, depending on culture and region. Like if you look at the way that people from way, way, way in the north worship versus the way that people, I don't know, in the east or across different continents worship the one, they're all different practices. Like you're going to see something more akin to like historic Buddhism or Shintoism in different parts of the World Carver universe. But the focus throughout most of Cult of the Maw is going to be on something more akin to Spanish Catholicism, um, or in certain parts of Roman Catholicism, in others more Spanish. Um, and we'll talk more about sort of the geography of the world as well, because I had a about creating, a map so that you guys could actually understand the scale of the world and um, exactly what goes where and who does what and where everything is. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but we'll go back to just the one, the World Carver, as she, it is referred to by everyone. And in the creation myth, it is. I touched upon it very, very, very briefly when Lord Hyde was in the cathedral. The creation myth is a bit bare bones. It just essentially recounts that in the very beginning there was nothing at all, like the whatever existed before the Big Bang, which is, nothing. And then out of the nothing came the one. There's no explanation as to where the one came from because that's kind of always been a theological hurdle in every faith known to man is the idea of, God created us, who created God? Good frickin' question. I don't have an answer. Neither do they. Um, but nevertheless, out of that nothingness came the one. And along with the one came the Fae, or the fairies. So there are three um, races that you will be encountering throughout this entire universe. Just three. Never any more than that. Well, actually, you know what? I'll compromise and say three and a half. But we're just going to stick with the three initially. And the very first of those is the fairies. The fairies were the very first of all life. They didn't exist with physical bodies. They were essentially just um, formless consciousness. It's a little bit esoteric because we're talking about beings that existed before, there was a universe to exist in. When it was essentially just the vacuum of space, they were just consciousness sort of floating around out in the void. Um, and the way that the creation myth is worded is a little bit esoteric. It refers to the world carver, or the one, picking up a carving knife and beginning to whittle the world into existence. Obviously, that's not completely literal. Um, if you think about it as more allegorical, in the same sense that, certain other cultures in history have considered God to be like forging the universe, with like a hammer and anvil. And I had a similar idea of calling this the World Forger universe instead of World Carver. Um, but I scrapped that idea because what I wanted for this deity is to have a lot of imagery of being very benevolent and very gentle. And something about blacksmithing has, a little bit of violence associated with it, purely because, you're talking about swinging hammers and smashing anvils and forcing metal to bend into a different form. I kind of wanted to avoid that style of imagery. So I decided instead of having a deity that is forging the world, what about this image of like an old man sitting on a stump, just quietly whittling with a little knife? And that to me struck a chord. It just seemed so much more peaceful and so much more serene, and that was the kind of imagery that I wanted for the creator god of this universe. So that's why it's referred to as World Carver instead of World Forger. So in that creation myth, the World Forger creates the universe and the world, everything in it. The vacuum of space, the planets, the stars, all of it. Um, we're kind of starting from the very beginning. I know the very first question was about the Iron Hand, but it's difficult for me to talk about the Iron Hand out the gate without explaining more about the world we're living in first. So we are going to get there. And if you guys have other questions as I'm speaking, interrupt me, and I'll cover those as best I can. So, ow. Okay, okay. Hold on. I'll just punch this dog. Oh yeah, I don't have any weapons. Anyways, we're talking about the world being formed, everything in the beginning as it was. Um, Plants, animals, landmarks, all of it. This all just sprang into being because it was being carved. Um, and the fairies existed too at that point in time. Before the world itself existed, the fairies existed. So whenever I talk about the fairies in Cult of the Maw, and they're referred to as not having bodies or of just being these formless entities, it's very literal in that sense. They were always there. They are essentially immortal ghosts. But when the world was brand new and they first saw it, there was this sense of delight. Like, imagine being a little kid and watching, watching your dad put together play equipment in your backyard. That was the same general feeling when the Fae saw the World Carver create the world. They thought, this is amazing. This is this place that we have to exist in and uh, to play in and to become mortal in. So when the world was created and it was brand new, when all the plants and animals were in it, the fairies, just by their own design, because every single fairy is essentially like a less potent version of the world carver, uh, they conjured up bodies for themselves of flesh and blood. So we'll discuss why they don't do that anymore. That's further along in the history. But in the first age, the age of the fairies, um, they were flesh and blood beings, and they were very tall and very beautiful, um, which was a very easy decision to make because almost every culture in history that has fairies in it as like a mythological element describes them as being very beautiful. And I wanted them to almost capture this serene elegance of angelic beings because that's what they are. They're these immortal, ageless, uh, wise, and powerful beings that have just decided to gird themselves in flesh and walk the world and be its caretakers. So that was their job. They were the custodians of the world when it was young, when the world was brand new. Um, and that was the case for many years and centuries. And this is before any other sentient life existed. So there were no trolls, there were no Duero. Um, None of those existed yet. All that there were animals and plants and fairies who would look after them. And there was one particular fairy that I want us to focus on because he is very crucial to the overall history of the world. I mean, everything changed because of this guy, and you've already been introduced to him in Cult of the Maw because he's referred to as Rattenwick. And someone in the comments actually pointed out that they, from context clues, had discerned that Rattenwick is essentially Satan, and the Black Sires are like demons. Absolutely accurate. Um, but just like in, all the stories and in Christianity, before becoming the devil, Lucifer was an angel. Such is the case with Rattenwick as well. Before he was Rattenwick, his name was Oberon. Um, and much like the devil, he was the most beautiful and the most wise and the most powerful of all of the fairies. He was the one that was, in charge of all the others. If if they could look to a leader before or second to the World Carver, that leader was Oberon. Um, he would sort of uh, watch over everyone and make sure that they were doing their jobs correctly because they were supposed to be looking after the Carver's creation. Um, and there's this sense in Oberon as he walks the world and looks after it and performs his duties as caretaker, this almost I don't want to call it indignation because that makes it seem hostile from the start, but you know what? We'll describe it as pride. This sense of, hey, I'm the one who's actually down here, walking the world. I didn't create it, but I'm the one who's in it, and I'm the one who's seeing everything um, that has been created. And as I'm walking it, I'm starting to recognize that there are flaws. They're little flaws. Obviously, I don't want to overstep my bounds and call out, my creator and my father, but there's death and there's disease and there's decay and there are animals that hunt and kill other animals. There's even this early on, Oberon is looking at the world and seeing that there is misery in it. In little ways, there are problems. So he approaches the one in supplication, very respectfully, and he brings up his concerns that the world, as beautiful as it is flawed, and that if the World Carver would lend his power and his authority as a deity to Oberon, then they could make the whole world as beautiful and as ageless and as immortal as the fairies are. Um, which, with the right pitch can sound pretty good. If everyone was immortal, nobody had to hurt each other, there was no killing, no death, no decay, no disease, none of it. It was a pretty good sales pitch. Um, and this speaks a little bit to my own personal philosophy, but the World Carver denied him, with the rebuttal of that these things are there for a reason. That decay is new life springing out of death. It's all a part of a cycle. And I know it's a bit cliche to talk about the circle of life, but legitimately, again, we're getting into my own personal philosophy, but that entire process and cycle is extremely important, I feel. Because without it, if everything was eternal, there wouldn't be any reason for the world to exist. And I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Oh, oops, died. But um, this is how the first War of Wrath began. Um, the World Carver denied Oberon his request, and Oberon was humiliated. I mean, this is the wisest and the strongest and the most beautiful of all the Fae going to their father and saying, "Hey, this is my advice to you. I've been walking the world. I've been looking after it, and I have some ideas on how we can make it better." And his father essentially telling him, "Your ideas are stupid and misguided. Go back. you're not getting like it was a full denial of what Oberyn believed was his right. It was almost a sense of I've been the one looking after this world. I should have the right to make changes to it as I see fit because I'm the one doing the work. Um, so this is how we get to the first War of Wrath, and when Oberyn took up the name Ratenwyck, an objectively evil-sounding name, yes, but cliches exist for a reason. Um, I can't afford that. Maybe I can sell some stuff to afford it. Um, where was I? Right, first War of Wrath. I know we're covering a lot of stuff right now, but I promise we're gonna get to the Iron Hand later on. Um, I'm just playing the game at the moment. Also, it's a little disheartening that no one has showed up. There was that one person who asked that one question, and now they're gone. Bit of a shame, but that's life for you. Maybe I should reschedule this, because it seems like most folks just aren't gonna be able to make it. I'll keep it going, and I'll keep explaining things so that this record is here for posterity, so that if people, later on would like to look over the lore of the series and learn more about it, that opportunity is there. Um, in any case, the First War of Wrath, this is the first war ever. This is the first conflict in history. It's the first time there's been any kind of conflict, and we're talking about, you know, uh, the caretakers of the world. We're talking about um, beings whose language is made up entirely of words of power. These are the beings who helped create the world um, of this entire fictional universe. So when they clashed and they came together in a war, this is cataclysmic. It's Armageddon. Um, and obviously, in the end, the rebellion fails. Ratenwyck and his lieutenants and his rebellion is brought down and destroyed because that's what happens in these sorts of stories. Um, I don't know if there are people watching and they just keep and the counter is messing up here, but I don't know. I keep seeing the counter for people who are watching go from 0 to 1 and then back to 0, which is a little disheartening because it does make me think that people are showing up and listening to me speak like 3 words and then leaving again, which I hope is not the case, but if it is, sorry that I'm boring you, I suppose. Um, what was I going to say next? Oh, yeah. Um, so, the punishment for this transgression and for all the lives that were lost during this war was that Ratenwyck was stripped of his beauty and his form and everything about him that made him, you know, Fey was taken. So with that, all that was left, with all fairness and all beauty taken away from him, all that was left was this black, furious, writhing, hateful soul. And before any further punishment could be dealt, he fled and ran away. Him and all of his fellow rebels who rose up against the World Carver with him. So we're talking about, the defeat of Satan and his demons, the defeat of the end of the war in heaven, that entire sort of deal condensed into this other form. So a lot of this stuff, if you were to read, Paradise Lost, or even just the creation myths in the Bible itself, you would already understand a lot of what's going on here. So I'm going to skim over this quite briefly. Something to note, though, is that this is the end of the First Age. The War of Wrath marks the ending of the First Age. And why that is important is because this is going to explain where the trolls came from. Um, in solidarity, and I guess out of not shame or remorse, but just sadness that it had to happen, the remaining loyal fairies, who still had, beautiful bodies and flesh and blood, cast those off, and they abandoned them, um, deciding that they would no longer exist as physical presences in the world around them. They thought that because of the sins of their brothers and their kin, they had forfeited that right. So, recognizing that, they cast off their flesh and their blood and their mortal bodies, and that cast off and discarded flesh and blood was revived as the troll folk. So when I talked before about the fairies being, inhumanly, immortally beautiful, the sort of thing that you could only ever dream of in terms of how, amazing they looked, it was because they were perfect. So when we talk about trolls at any point during Cult of the Maw, they're often going to be referred to as extremely beautiful, kind of defeating the image that you might have in your head of what a troll is supposed to be. But I'm going to use this not to catapult into talking about the Second Age. We're going to get to that, but I'm going to talk a little more about the different mortal races. I led into it before, but so we have the fairies, the trolls, and the dwarves, or the Duero, as they are referred to. And something to note that I think a lot of you may have gotten already, just from context clues. The dwarves are not actually dwarfish. They're not actually like dwarves as you would see in like the works of Tolkien. They're actually just humans like you and me. The reason they're referred to as dwarves is because they are the youngest race to exist in this world. And compared to the trolls, who stand on average between 8 and 9 feet tall, ordinary humans like you and me are going to look pretty darn small. So that's why they're referred to as dwarves or Duero or the little people. Because compared to, the standard, which is the trolls and the original Fae, they are very, very small. So that should clear that up, I hope. But so yes, the sequence in which these races came into existence was first there were the fairies. Then, when the fairies ended the First War of Wrath and they cast off their flesh and blood, born out of that came the trolls, and there started the Second Age, the age of the troll folk. And a lot of the Age of the Trolls is essentially something you can just copy as our basic human history. They went from savage cave people to very basic agrarian societies, hunter-gatherers, that sort of deal. And if you follow, our own human history somewhat similarly, you're going to have a basic idea of how the trolls were. The only big difference that I want to bring up is because they are so much bigger and stronger than human beings like you or me would be, the trolls didn't need to rely as much on technology. Obviously, they did still develop technology, but it was less of a necessity for them as it is for us. Because if you look at, human development of technology and the way we developed it through hunting and through building, a lot of those technologies came out of necessity because human beings are, compared to a lot of the animals in the animal kingdom, pretty small and weak. Whereas, in Cult of the Maw and World Carver, trolls are big and very strong. We're talking about creatures that are essentially an entire race of Warhammer 40k Space Marines. They're huge and they're very strong. The smallest and weakest of them are still pushing 7. Like the smallest and weakest are over 7 feet tall, and the absolute largest and strongest of them are around 9 feet tall. so they're very very big, and they're immensely strong, and their culture is based a lot around dominance. Um, there's this sort of pioneering sense about them. Not dominance in a malicious light either. I know a lot of fantasy authors and a lot of writers use the word dominance, or the idea that someone seeks to dominate the world around them, as being a negative thing. Um, I don't see it that way, and I especially don't see it that way with the trolls. They they want to dominate the world around them, but they want to do it less to be, tyrants or controlling of the world, and more because they want to understand it. They want to make it safe for themselves. Um, they want to control it because they feel it is their inheritance. And to an extent, it is. The trolls they didn't just spring into being. The One created them as well. The World Carver, that is. So the fairies and the trolls existed together during the Second Age. Um, and that Second Age was a time of, um, for the most part, where there's war and there's peace, there's conflict and resolution, and many, many, many great and very powerful troll kingdoms and civilizations arose and fell and then rose again during this time. Um, I actually want to pause for just a moment and go back to the First Age, or particularly to the First War of Wrath, because there is a very important character that I forgot to mention. And he has been mentioned very briefly in Cult of the Maw, referred to as Saint Lurien the Fair. I believe Saint Lurien the Fair was mentioned very, very briefly. And who Lurien was he was a fairy during the First War of Wrath. If you think of like Saint Michael the Archangel, Lurien is essentially that. When the First War of Wrath kicked off, the World Carver chose a champion to lead the righteous against Ratenwick, and Lurien the Fair was the leader of that host. So when you think of who Ratenwick's major enemy is, I don't want you to think of Ratenwick's main enemy being the One or the World Carver, because that was a fight Ratenwick was never going to win. This is a very, very powerful angel, but still just an angel, essentially picking a fight with God. It was never going to end well for him. Um, I don't know why I'm just farming this one character. Let's see. What do I need so that I can use this sword properly? Give me 1 second. Oh, we need dexterity. Okay, well I can get a little bit of that. Anyways, yeah, so every reference to Lurien is in reference to his sainthood, his righteousness, the fact that he um, stood against the darkness and succeeded. Lurien is the reason that the righteous won the War of Wrath. They would not have succeeded if it wasn't for his leadership. Um, whether or not Ratenwick could have ever actually picked a fight with the World Carver or not, the answer's no. At the end of it all, if it came right down to it, there was no way Ratenwick was going to win. But Lurien was the driving force behind Ratenwick's defeat in the First War of Wrath. And when that First War of Wrath was over, Lurien was the only one of the fairies who did not give up his flesh and blood in his body. So we're talking about the only fairy in existence to still have a mortal flesh and blood form. And there is a very particular reason why that is important, and I will tell you that in just a moment. So moving forward to the Second Age, the Age of the Trollfolk, and they're building their places and cities. They are settling and building kingdoms. Wars were fought and won, and new kingdoms arose. And Lurien, the fairy, forsook his immortal life. So even though he had a flesh and blood body, he was ageless and immortal. He would have lived forever. But he gave that up in order to, um, to live a mortal existence with the woman he loved. Uh, there's not a lot that's known about her at all because I haven't written a lot about her. And honestly, there's not a lot written about Lurien either because aside from what he did and what his descendants did, he's not really that important to the current narrative. So if you guys really wanted to know more about Lurien, the only thing I can say is, uh, too bad. The point is, Lurien settled in a valley um, in the east that became known as Hilur. So Lurien settled in the valley of Hilur, and it was a beautiful, beautiful valley, referred to for decades to come as a valley beloved of the One. So we're talking about a place, analogous to reality, where to our own world, that would be considered so beautiful and so immaculate that it was favored by God. And that was the valley of Hilur. So now we're not quite there yet, but we're getting close to where the Iron Hand comes into things. Um, just hold on a little bit longer. I know I've been talking for half an hour already about basic world building, but the Second Age, and in particular the end of the Second Age, that is where the Iron Hand starts to come into play. And actually, I'm very excited to talk about him because the Iron Hand is one of my favorite characters of the Second Age. Um, but Valley of Hilur, Kingdom of Hilur, beautiful, beautiful valley. And here is where Lurien settled and had children. And in this valley, those children, spread, and his lineage grew, and wonderful, wonderful things. Everyone's happy, or mostly happy. Yada yada, bing bong boo. Um, but the good times do not last forever, as I'm sure everyone is aware. The fairies, for their part, began to teach the trolls, essentially their you know new young children, at least compared to the fairies who have been alive for centuries. They begin to teach them their language, and like I said before, the fairy language is entirely made up of words of power. So if you think about the fairy language for what it is, this isn't going to work, is it? Um, we're talking about a language that is made up entirely of words that can change the world around you. So when the fairies were creating the world, or shaping it, or guiding it, which however you want to call it, they could essentially make the supernatural occur just by commanding it to be so. Um, Words of power. So like, let's say that a fairy wants to make the flowers bloom. They would command the flowers to bloom, and the flowers would bloom, because that's the kind of power these beings have. So as they're teaching the trolls their language, the trolls are turning it into uh, a form of study, which would become known as runesmithing. So trolls don't have the innate power that the fairies have. They can't just speak these words and make them carry the same weight. What they did learn how to do is inscribe those words of power, hence the term runesmithing. So certain tools like quills or chisels became very, very important to runesmiths. And with those tools and with that knowledge and that artistry, they began to learn how to essentially do a discount version of Fey magic. And that's what we're talking about, the beginning of the end here, because this was a huge, huge mistake to give the power to shape and change the world to beings whose main drive and focus is to dominate. So there was a particular sect of trolls, a particular group of gifted runesmiths, very, very gifted sorcerers, who decided, and we're getting again into biblical territory, that they wanted to start creating their own new runes, essentially tampering with the language of the fairies, and they began thinking of themselves as so great that they could um, hold audience with the world carver, essentially thinking themselves so amazing that they could be like God. I think we all know where this is going, and it's not very pretty. Um, I still can't use that, huh? What do I need to be able to use that? 16 dexterity or something? Anyways, um, so to make a very long story short, Tower of Babel. They began building this tower in the valley of Hilur, and that didn't go over very well for them. It really didn't. Um, there was a conflict in which the runesmiths battled against the fairies who had taught them. And the funny thing about fighting against the people who taught you how to do your thing, you're not going to win. So the runesmiths lost that conflict, and all of them who had attempted this were, just like Rattenwick, punished. They were punished by a great chasm opening up in the earth in this valley, and all of the runesmiths were cast down into this chasm. They weren't killed, but they were cast down into this chasm to live out the remainder of their days in the dark, sealed away from all the lights, sealed away from the sun and from, you know, everything else about the world. They were forced underground, and the kingdom of Hilur was then rebuilt on top of the chasm, essentially as like a guardhouse to a prison. This entire kingdom, which was founded and kept by the heirs or descendants of Lurien the Fair, was a seal to keep the runesmiths trapped underground. And this is, this is about halfway through the Second Age, so a couple hundred more years passed, and this is where we get into the interesting stuff. Down in the chasm, the runesmiths began their own new dynasty, and we actually split into two separate breeds of troll. There are the basic trolls, the trolls that we generally encounter in Cult of the Maw and in the rest of the World Carver universe, but there are also these chasmic trolls, trolls who essentially evolved to adapt to living underground. They're slightly shorter. These ones, instead of being 8 to 9 feet tall, are only about 7 to 8 feet tall. They're less muscular, less robust, paler. They can see in the dark. But more importantly, they all continued their tradition of runesmithing down in the darkness. And they built their own dynasty and their own kingdom down in this chasm. And towards the end of the Second Age, as we get close to the end of the Second Age, there was a particular set of heirs to this new chasmic dynasty, and their names were Hieronymus and Myrna. And some of you may remember the name Myrna because of the prayer in the beginning of the most recent chapter of Cult of the Maw. Colette speaks a prayer to Saint Myrna the Defiant. Myrna is very, very important to the Second War of Wrath, to the story of the Iron Hand. There is so much going on there that I will need to tell you about. And we're going to get there in just a minute. I can't believe I've just spent almost an hour setting up the answers to the first question. But yes, so Myrna and Hieronymus are the prince and princess of the chasm, this kingdom that exists underneath the kingdom of Hilur. The heir to the throne is Hieronymus. He is the elder of the two siblings, and he is destined for the throne. He was promised it. He was raised his whole life being told that he was going to be the king of the chasm one day. For however much that is worth. They are still trapped underground and can't leave, but they've spent so many decades to centuries down there that, they've made their peace with the fact that they can't leave. They have their own life down there, and the chasm is its own realm. So Hieronymus is groomed for the throne. He is promised the throne. He is told time and time again that he will get to have this. But Hieronymus was kind of a basket case of a child. He had these dreams and visions, even as just a very young boy, of being the one to lead his people, the Chasmic Trolls, out of the darkness of the chasm and back into the light of this sort of mass exodus that he would be the leader of, where they would take revenge on the kingdom of Hilur and on the heirs of Lurien, who imprisoned them. In his opinion, wrongfully imprisoned them, because there's nothing wrong, at least in his mind, with runesmithing and with magic. So he was a very talented, very powerful wizard, as all of the royals of the chasm were. And once again, we're getting into semantics a bit here. The way sorcery works in the World Carver universe and the way that magic works is it's a language. So how powerful you are depends entirely on a couple of different factors. 3 factors, to be particular. If you think about it almost like a programming language, like C++ or... I can't think of another programming language at the moment, but if you think of it in the same sense of a programming language, that is how you determine the power of a runesmith. There is your understanding of the language itself, so like your vocabulary. There is the syntax of putting together the command you're trying to make. Again, much like computer coding, there is very specific ways that you want to write out runes to make them do what you want. So if you're a runesmith and you want to, let's say, conjure a fireball, you would need to know both all the right words to make that happen, as well as the syntax of getting the magical words to do what you want. The last factor is the tool that you use. Runesmiths, like I said before, would use catalysts like chisels or quills or all kinds of, different, tools to cast their magic. You would essentially inscribe it in objects or in the air around you. And ow, that hurt. Ow. I might lose this fight while I'm just talking, but that's okay. So, Hieronymus was very talented. He was essentially a linguistic prodigy in terms of runesmithing, and he had this dream of being the one that would free the Chasmic people from their imprisonment. And as a young man, he committed an absolutely awful human rights violation crime, which was the invention of something referred to as the Witch Forge. And we're going to talk a little more about what the Witch Forge is, what it does, and how heinous it is in a little bit. But the point is, if the name itself didn't give that away, this Witch Forge was awful. And he tested it on the dregs of Chasmic society, criminals or poor people, people who he, as a prince, had little regard for. He tested the Witch Forge on them, and his father, the king, found out. He found the Witch Forge, found what his son was doing, and he was disgusted. And rightfully so, because, again, horrible human rights violations here. This was, like... We're talking worse than, like, the gulags. This is awful stuff, and I lost. And you know what? Screw it. We'll talk about what the Witch Forge does right now. This is a machine, inscribed very delicately, very expertly by a runesmith of Hieronymus's particular skill. With this intention that you will put someone or something or 2 somethings inside, and you will break them down to their base biological states and then remake them into something else. And what Hieronymus was doing was he was trying to use the Witch Forge to build an army that he assumed he'd be able to use to reclaim the world above. His people are trapped underground. He sees all these outcasts, criminals, homeless people, people who he considers to be unproductive in society, and he thinks, hey, I'll find a use for them. These people, or rather their biomass, will be the fuel for my people's exodus back into the light. So he was kidnapping people off the streets, and he was taking them to his I guess laboratory would be the right word for it, and inserting them into the Witch Forge and having them transformed or recombinated into these horrible monstrosities referred to as reforged. Just terrible monsters that could barely have been ever considered people. So when his father found out that he'd been doing this, he was so horrifically disgusted by the Witch Forge and everything that it entailed that he revoked Hieronymus's princehood. He revoked his... Well, actually, not even just saying that, you are no longer prince. In his own words, Hieronymus was no longer even his son, because he was so horrified by what his own son had been doing to these people. So he revoked Hieronymus's princehood, he revoked his claim to the crown, and he even took away his name. He was no longer the prince or former prince was no longer even referred to as Hieronymus. He was given the extremely humiliating name of Gant. Just Gant. And instead of him, his sister Myrna would instead inherit the crown. She would be the new heir, since Hieronymus was so fucked in the head. Hieronymus was furious. He thought, in his own words, or in his own mind, that he'd been doing a good thing. He'd been doing, a service to the kingdom. He was trying to fight for their freedom, and his father had humiliated him, he had disgraced him, and he had taken away everything that had been promised to Gant. There's this sense of, I don't want to say entitlement, but I guess that's kind of what it is. I actually empathize with Gant a lot, and I know that sounds awful considering he's the worst, but I do. I feel bad because, you're... And obviously there's, a sense of dumbass, why are you feeling bad? You invented this character and all the shit that happened to him. But I understand the feelings that this character goes through in this sense of, here's everything that I was promised. I made one little mistake, or, while trying to do the right thing, or trying to be helpful, and now I've been punished by having everything taken away from me. So when Hieronymus, now mockingly referred to as Gant, humiliated by his entire people, thought ahead to his future, he saw nothing worthwhile. He was disgraced and humiliated, and he wanted to kill himself. So he wandered out into the deepest caverns of the chasm with the intent of taking his own life. He fully intended to kill himself because he was so miserable and so unhappy. But he didn't. He didn't end up committing suicide. And the reason he didn't was because he found what he refers to as a god in the darkness. He did not find a god in the darkness. What he found was Rattenwick. Rattenwick, since, for the entirety of the Second Age, the Age of the Trollfolk, he still existed in this base, ugly, pathetic form. He still existed. And he just hated the trolls. He hated everything about the trolls. He hated the fact that they were violent, that they waged wars against each other. He hated the fact that they desired dominance. He hated everything about the trolls. And he specifically thought Hieronymus was disgusting and pathetic. But he saw in Hieronymus Gant the potential for a comeback, a chance for Rattenwick to rise again and make a second attempt at claiming this world as his. So he presented himself as a god to Hieronymus Gant, and Gant, feeling like he has nothing left to lose and everything to gain, pledged himself to this god. Obviously, he didn't know it was Rattenwick. There was no way he could have known. If he ever did know that it was Rattenwick, he would never have done this. Even Gant wasn't that so far gone as to make a deal with the literal devil, but he didn't know what he was doing. So he took Rattenwick, this darkness, or in his own eyes, this god, into his own body. Literally swallowed him. So Rattenwick is living in Gant's stomach. And in vengeance, he came back to his own Chasmic Citadel and murdered his mother and father, in rage, immediately subjugated the court sorcerers, um, convinced essentially everyone in the entire chasm very, very quickly that he had found a god, because how else could he have this kind of power? There's no other way he could have done it. The only person he couldn't convince was his sister, Myrna. Myrna saw through Gant. She kind of always had seen through Gant. She had almost always been disdainful of him. Um, but instead of killing her, Gant was unable to bring himself to kill his beloved sister because she was one of the only people he ever loved. And I'm not talking about in like a Jaime Lannister and Cersei Lannister incesty kind of love. This is he just very much loved his sister. So he wasn't willing to kill her, even though she had been given everything that was supposed to be his. So instead, he cursed her. He took away from her her beauty, her form, and the curse, warped her mind so she couldn't use runesmithing as effectively, and he banished her from the chasm. So she fled and ran, because what else can you do in that kind of situation but run away? And this is where we come to the Iron Hand. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail from this point forward about that story, because that's a whole prequel story that I want you guys to be able to experience spoiler free. But the Iron Hand was Myrna's lifeline. He was a stranger that she met in her exile, um, who agreed to help her to reclaim her throne, which, Gant had taken, and to try and liberate the chasm from the monster her brother had turned into. So I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail about the Iron Hand, because that's his story, but the reason he's referred to as vile, and the reason that he's considered to be the most horrific traitor in history, is because Myrna and the Iron Hand were they were a love story. They worked together. They fought against Gant and his Reforged together, and they fell for one another. And they actually were well on their way to succeeding and defeating Hieronymus Gant for good when Rattenwick returned. In my notes, I've put it in that he tore himself free from Gant's flesh, and came back into the world as a complete and total return of his old self. So we're talking about something that is like 12 feet tall, beautiful, shining, golden, godlike. And in that moment, upon seeing him, the Iron Hand immediately knelt and betrayed Myrna in order to serve Rattenwick. So that's why he's referred to as this horrific traitor, because he essentially sold out the woman he loved to serve Rattenwick. And there is, it's a bit more complex than that. There's more to it than that. But I'm going to save that until we get to that point in the narrative when we talk in more detail about the Iron Hand. And that's why Myrna is referred to as Saint Myrna the Defiant, or the Bloodied Bride, because she was the Iron Hand's bride at that time. And when all of her allies were corrupted and turned to serve Rattenwick, she was the only one who remained defiant. And she fought against Rattenwick, and she lost, because again, it's a total mismatch. You're talking about the most powerful angelic being of all time versus a very competent sorceress. She lost and was killed. And both the Iron Hand and all of the trolls who were present at the moment of Rattenwick's return, they became what is known as the Nith. And some of you remember the Nith from that nursery rhyme in the very first chapter. Let me see if I can find that nursery rhyme. Oh, I just dropped my controller. Let's see. There we go. Rhyme of the Nith. Beware of the Nith, they who stalk in the wood, who snatch children up, who don't do as they should. For naughty young pups who do cause such a din, through the cracks in your timbers the Nith will creep in. They'll come up on you as you lay in your bed, and their mantles are as white as the hoods on their heads. For vile Iron Hand, they'll peel off all your skin. To replace what is missing, they'll bring it to him. And mother and father asleep in their bed won't know until morning their child is dead. So always behave and repent for your sin, and maybe, just maybe, the Nith won't slip in. So the Nith are the remnants of those trolls who were corrupted by Rattenwick upon his return. And if you want to think of them like ghost wraith vampires, that's what they are. And there is part of the myth surrounding them in the modern era, where Cult of the Maw takes place, is that they want to peel off all of your skin when they catch you and give it to the Iron Hand so he can replace the missing flesh of his own Iron Hand. So he can have a flesh and blood hand again. That's the myth surrounding it. Again, I don't want to confirm or deny too much and create a conflict of interest with spoilers, but that's a lot of the context on both the first and the second age. And I'm not. No one has shown up for the entirety of this question and answer stream to ask any questions or get any answers, but I'm going to continue talking about the Second War of Wrath, which began after Rattenwick's return. I know it sounded like the Second War of Wrath was that battle in the Kingdom of Helur, but it was not. The battle in the Kingdom of Helur was kind of the precursor to the Second War of Wrath. That was an extremely tiny conflict in comparison to this. We're talking about a civil war within a single valley versus a war that spans the entire planet. The Second War of Wrath was Rattenwick, who had just come back through the mistakes of Hieronymus Gant. His Nith, of which there were 12 extremely powerful wraith vampire monstrosities who were very loyal to him, and the 5 Black Sires. These Black Sires were the only survivors of the original fairies who, helped Rattenwick rise up against the World Carver in the First War of Wrath. So when Rattenwick and all of the traitor fairies all fled together, these 5 are the only ones to have survived. They were the strongest. Fovier, greetings. Welcome to the Q&A. We are in the process of talking about the Black Sires and the Second War of Wrath. If you want more information about the First Age and the First War of Wrath, you're going to have to back up a little bit. But yes, so the Second War of Wrath, 5 Black Sires. We have the Pale Lady. She does not have a proper given name. I mean, she probably does, but it's never revealed, and I never thought of one because I never intended for it to be revealed. The Pale Lady is the only one of the Black Sires who you guys, well, one of the Black Sires who you guys have been introduced to in Cult of the Maw. Her entire shtick, her entire purpose is her stewardship back when she was still a proper fairy before she became a monster. She was the steward of the concept of birth. So the very concept that mortal life can reproduce either sexually or asexually, that all came from her, and that should give you sort of an idea of what these fairies' duties were during the First Age, and what they could do, in that just one of them was responsible for the entire concept of reproduction. She was the one who was constantly giving birth to the armies of monsters and creatures that fought in this Second War of Wrath. And this is kind of where we're getting into the formation. Wonder what position the Pale Lady likes. All of them. She would be down with all of them. And while we're talking about the Pale Lady, we're going to talk about her lover. Because out of all the Black Sires, the Pale Lady is the only one who um, is in any kind of relationship. And this brings us to our second Black Sire, Tir Ungol the Serpent. Tir Ungol is, well, probably the weakest out of all the Black Sires. Um, Referred to as the first turncoat, the Great Serpent, um, sometimes the Clever, but not very often. And during the first War of Wrath, way back when, he couldn't pick a side. He didn't believe in anything, really. He just wanted to be on whichever side was going to win. Um, and he very foolishly picked the wrong side. He ended up choosing Rattenwick over the World Carver, and was punished for it. But what makes Tir Ungol interesting is his relationship with the Pale Lady. The Pale Lady... Tir seems like the type to play mind games. Yes, Tir Ungol is very, very much the sort to play mind games. If you remember in the first chapter, when Rai was down in the abandoned mine, and he was led down there by another Duero, who ended up having a giant snake inside of him. That snake, that was Tir Ungol. Tir Ungol is one of the Black Sires, so the Duero in Cult of the Maw right now are actually facing not one massive threat, but two. They're facing the Pale Lady, and they're facing Tir Ungol together, because the two of them are kind of like an evil power couple. When he was still a fairy before he became the Great Serpent, his entire stewardship was he was in charge of burgeoning intelligence, or not quite evolution, but I guess natural selection in a sense. His whole shtick was the idea of learning and intelligence developing in creatures. So if you think about like the very first organisms slowly gaining intelligence and sentience, that's all Tir Ungol. So the reason the Pale Lady adores him so much, the reason she's so in love with him, is because they go hand in hand together. You know, he is almost the driving force of evolution and of generational improvement. You know, things getting smarter and stronger and more viable generation by generation, and she is the concept of there being generations and there being, you know, children to come after their parents. So the two of them worked extremely well together, and the two of them together, along with our third Black Sire, created the race of goblins. Some of you guys might remember that the Duero, or, you know, humanity, in Cult of the Maw, used to be goblins. This is how goblins were created. You have three of the Black Sires coming together to create them, and those three are Tir Ungol the Serpent, the Pale Lady, and Haskir the Monster King. Haskir the Monster King also technically goes hand in hand with these other two, but he is much more his own guy. The Pale Lady and Tir Ungol don't like him very much. In fact, nobody likes him very much. Haskir, the Monster King, when he was a fairy, was in charge of the idea of change. The concept... yeah, we're going origin stories now. So Haskir was the concept of change, and the idea that if anything becomes stagnant, that thing to Haskir is odious. He hates it. He hates the idea of stagnancy. Everything has to be in flux, otherwise it will fail. It will, you know, nothing can remain as it is. So the three of them together created the race of goblins, these ugly, tiny, pathetic and fearful and hateful creatures who would make up Rattenwick's new army. So, Second War of Wrath, we're looking at the Black Sires, armies of goblins and other monsters, the 12 Nith, and last but not least, our last two Black Sires. We'll start with Aurthane the Clinging Shade, and Aurthane wasn't really there for any of this. because our Thane does not have any kind of physical presence. He, much like a lot of the fairies, is just more of a formless consciousness. But the reason he's called the Clinging Shade is because he is an idea. Our Thane is a thought that sticks in your mind, and you can never stop thinking of it. So if you've ever had a thought, that just keeps popping up in your brain, or a song stuck in your head, that's our Thane. Who he was before he fell, before he became the Clinging Shade, was his name was Orain, or Orain the Dreamweaver, and as a fairy, his entire stewardship was the concept of dreams. So whenever anything would sleep, he would weave their dreams into existence. But when he fell, he's the game. Yes, exactly. Our Thane is the game, which I just lost. Thanks for that, by the way. Man, fucking, I just lost. I'll get you for that. But anyways, he wasn't there. He wasn't present for the actual war, but he did. He did, make appearances in many people's minds, in the sense that when people were afraid during the war, or there was this idea that maybe we should all just give up, that's our Thane at work. The Clinging Shade that sticks in the mind and never lets go. And our last Black Sire, and my personal favorite of the bunch, is Hirsoth, or by his full title, Hirsoth Dragon Sire. And he's called the Dragon Sire for a very good reason, because he is the first dragon. And dragons in the World Carver universe are awful. There's no other way I can describe it. When I first decided that I wanted there to be dragons in this fantasy world, I thought to myself, I'm kind of sick of dragons just being big lizards. Or of even, the typical depictions of dragons in modern media. I wanted to think of a type of creature that is so awful that they would still elicit this spine-chilling response, even in our modern, extremely desensitized society. So if any of you read the community post I made last week about a group of trolls that went dragon hunting, and you got the description of what a dragon looks like, these creatures are essentially like enormous winged centipedes that breathe white phosphorus. So they are horrific, and they're intelligent. And Hirsoth is the strongest out of all of them. And to give you an idea of how big Hirsoth is and how powerful he is, when he's all coiled up, very snake-like, very centipede-like, Hirsoth is about the size of a mountain, to the point where multiple characters mistake him for a mountain. That's how big he is. And I love him. He doesn't care about any of these higher ideals or this war. Hirsoth's entire shtick, the only thing he gives a shit about, is becoming as yoked as possible. There's a reason why in the poll I made for Hirsoth, he's referred to as Strength Incarnate, because that's all he cares about. Like, Hirsoth is an absolute gym bro of a dragon. All he wants to do is get as strong as possible, and he's going to do that by eating everything around him. Dragons get stronger by eating things. Whatever they eat, they absorb into themselves, and it adds to their strength. So Hirsoth didn't even care that much about Rattenwick's Second War of Wrath. He was just, his essential concern was just, how much food am I going to get out of this? How many things am I going to get to eat to make myself stronger and bigger? That's all he cares about. He just wants to eat everything. And his end goal is to get so big he can eat the entire universe. Not even just the entire planet. The planet will be is an appetizer. Hirsoth wants to get big enough to eat the universe. That is his end goal. The Second War of Wrath was just his way of doing that. More things to eat, more people to add to his stomach. I am not going to win this fight. And I'm out of sippies. And I'm dead. But I love Hearsoft because I think his brain dead Jim Bro attitude is funny. So those are our Black Sires. We have armies of goblins. We have the Dragon Sire, the other Black Sires, other types of monsters, all clashing against the fairies and the trolls. And this is, this is our Avengers Endgame giant battle. This is the culmination of the entire Second Age. This is the battle for all the marbles. If the Second Age was a movie or even like a series, this would be the finale. This Second War of Wrath, and this encompasses the entire planet. But it comes to a head if you think of the world of World Carver as being analogous to our own world in terms of geography, then I want you to think about the fields of France or of Verdun, that entire sort of area. That's where the final battle of the Second War of Wrath took place. And I haven't put, even in my notes, there's not a lot of details on the Second War of Wrath, but there are some notes on how it ends. And the way that it ends is with all of the Black Sires retreating. Because again, you have to remember, as powerful as these things are, they are still less than the fairies who are uncorrupted. They are still nowhere near as mighty in magic as the fairies who remained true to the One. So all of the Black Sires fled. They all ran away. But Rattenwick didn't, and neither did the Nith. The Nith stayed on the field. And nobody could beat them. These are armies of trolls, armies of fairies. No one could match Rattenwick and his Nith in terms of raw power. So finally, one troll and one fairy, named Fahir. The troll was named Fahir. The fairy was named Adenwil. Took on Rattenwick, essentially 2v1. And they fought for, at least here in my notes, 10 days and 10 nights of just fighting. And eventually, at the end of those 10 days and 10 nights of endless battle between Fahir, Adenwil, and Rattenwick, Rattenwick let down a blow that shattered the sword of Fahir, and Adenwil, the fairy, shielding his companion with his body, was struck down and killed. And in that moment, Fahir took up the spear of Adenwil and drove it through Rattenwick's chest and into the ground. And he essentially nailed Rattenwick to the earth. If you think of it like, it's like a fight in Fate Stay Night. I don't know what that is. I assume that's a franchise of some sort, but I'm unfamiliar with it. Yeah, so 10 days, 10 nights. Adenwil is struck down and killed. Fahir nails Rattenwick to the earth with the spear, and in a miracle, where that spear struck, where the spearhead struck the ground, there gushed out an enormous flood. Oh, weeb knowledge. Oh, it's probably like an Amine then. Yeah, I don't know a lot about Amines. That's okay though. There was an enormous flood that came out from where the spearhead struck, and it buried Rattenwick and the Nith under an ocean, an enormous blood-colored ocean. And if you've been paying attention to the Cult of the Maw episodes, you would remember there is mention of something called the Red Sea. This is where the Red Sea came from. So I want you to think of, our actual real world and a map of our real actual world that we live in. And I want you to think of a map of Europe, because Europe is primarily where Cult of the Maw will be taking place. Okay, I'm dead. And I want you to imagine essentially all of France and all of. Oh, it's literal. Yeah, it is a literal Red Sea. It is blood red because of all the corpses and bodies and dead people that are at the bottom of it. It is literally a Red Sea. So I want you to think of essentially all of France and a pretty decent chunk of Germany um, being almost entirely flooded and buried under this red ocean, where Rattenwick was, defeated. And in his defeat, the Black Sires had fled, and the Goblin armies all fled too. And these goblins, without their leaders, without the Black Sires, and without Rattenwick to command them, they were pathetic. They didn't have any will to fight. They didn't have anyone to obey, so they just ran. They broke and they ran because that's what they were. They were, we're talking about things that are not 8 to 9 feet tall and not incredibly powerful with magic. They're just these little guys. So they all ran away, and they were hunted almost to extinction by the fairies and by the trolls. And a lot of them, most of them, fled down to what we would refer to as the Iberian Peninsula, and they hid underground. They essentially hightailed it to a mountain, and they made their home inside that mountain. And you guys will know that mountain as Ernholm. In modern day Cult of the Maw, that would later be known as Ernholm. But at the time, it was just where the goblins were hiding. Not all of them made it there. We're talking about an entire race of these poor little guys. Not all of them made it to this mountain, and the ones that didn't decided to make one last desperate attempt to carve out a piece of the world for themselves. So I want you to take a minute to think about the Valley of Hilur. Didn't think the fairies would be the proactive type. So yes and no. You have to remember that we can't really generalize. A lot of the fairies are quite inactive, but this is an entire race of beings, so some of them are going to be more willing to actively hunt goblins than others. Some are going to be, more sympathetic to these poor little creatures, but they're not going to actively try and help them. They're just not going to hunt them down. But I want you to think about the Valley of Hilur, the valley where Lurien's descendants used to live before Rattenwick's return. That valley is destroyed. This is the place where Rattenwick first revived, and the beings that call it home now are dragons. Yeah, hashtag not all fairies. So, the Kingdom of Hilur was devastated. No one is left alive there, neither there or in the chasm underneath it. Everyone who was there has either had to leave or they are dead. And the only things that live in that valley anymore are dragons, who spend all of their time killing and eating each other and anything else they can find. Because remember, dragons, by their very nature, all they care about is eating as much as possible to become as big as possible. Both the dragon sire, Hirsoth, and all of his children. So, greater dragons, lesser dragons, every dragon, hashtag not all fairies, but hashtag absolutely all dragons. All dragons care about the same thing, which is getting as yoked as possible. That is their entire purpose for existing. They all want to get swole. Hashtag yes all dragons. But this valley exists. None of the trolls are willing to go there because, we're talking about 30-foot long centipede demon monsters, and the 30-foot ones are the smaller ones. But these goblins have nowhere else to go. They think to themselves, look, the dragons have made their home in this valley, and the fairies and the trolls won't go there. So if we want to find a place where we can live and not be hunted, It's us or it's either us or the dragons. So all these goblins who were not hiding underground gathered up in a massive army, and they marched east to Dragon Country, uh, in a desperate attempt to try and take control of the valley, kill the dragons there, and create their own goblin homeland. And they failed horribly, and they all died. Literally all of them. It is compiled in a short, well, I say short, a poem that I have written as supplementary material called The Final March, or The Last March of Goblins, where they march to the east to try and carve out a home for themselves, and they are just brutally hunted to extinction by dragons, and all of them are eaten. It is not a happy ending for the goblins. They all died. The only goblins to survive are the ones who were hiding underground, and they slowly evolved to not be goblins anymore, but to be Duero. So that's where the Duero came from. And it was this idea that I had. You're gonna laugh, while I was rereading uh, Lord of the Rings. If you've read Tolkien's works, there are a lot of instances throughout all of the Lord of the Rings trilogy where you get to see orcs um, interacting with each other, outside of battle. And, it always struck me as weird that this was a whole other race that Tolkien treated as being just purely evil. But they had noble qualities, they would be, they had friends, and they were loyal to each other. Um, and I remember thinking to myself, how crazy would it be if, you know, someone took pity on them or had a thought about, how they were doing. So that was why I decided to make the Duero essentially humans, not you know, divinely created. If you think about the other mortal races, like the fairies and the trolls, they were proper children of the world carver. They were created on purpose. But the Duero and the goblins, they were the orcs of this setting. They were essentially created to be a pure evil servant or slave race, and they kind of grew beyond their programming. Oh my goodness, can these bats stop? It's freaking bats. Which, I don't know. To me, that always has struck a chord. I've always kind of had a soft spot for, um, you know, quote-unquote token evil races as a whole, because I think the idea of an entire race of beings being pure evil is kind of stupid. Obviously, with the exception of the dragons in this case. I don't want to come off as a hypocrite. But the dragons aren't evil. They're just hungry. And at a certain point, you get so gigantic that the only thing that can make you less hungry is other members of your own race. But regardless, that sort of covers a mass... Actually, that pretty much covers almost all the history that you need to know moving forward in World Carver. Obviously, this was like the Cliff's Notes version. There's still a lot of details and a lot of characters and a lot of other stuff that I've skipped over. A, for the sake of not spoiling everything. And B, because I don't want to destroy my voice and my throat while doing this. But with that overview kind of over and done with, we're going to move into the proper Q&A portions. So I'm just going to be quiet for a minute, and I'm going to wait for the questions to pour on in. And if you have those questions, you can just say them, and then I'll answer them. And if it's questions about, like, either the lore of the series or even just the series itself and where the next episode is, those sorts of questions I can also answer, or do my best to answer. Yeah, I know that I've just spent an hour and a half just giving you guys backstory, and even that's the short version. But there's a lot to think about. You have to remember, I've spent literally the past couple of years writing this stuff, and I am really excited to share all of it with you. but I need to kind of drip feed it because I don't want to spend massive amounts of time in the actual Cult of the Maw series just lore dumping. So what I've been doing so far is treating it like it's an actual living history, um, and treating it like the characters in the world would treat it, which is just as common knowledge or history, something that everybody knows, and kind of letting you guys pick up on context clues from there, with this stream as being the aside. But not, not everyone is going to be here for this stream, as evidenced by the fact that there are currently 3 people here. Um, so I guess consider yourselves the lucky ones. I'll try and keep this stream going for another half hour or so. Give it a nice solid 2 hours long. And then, oh, how you managed to make the story seem really refined. Um, yes and no. I mean, to say that I have experience as a writer is a little, I almost want to say hyperbolic. Um, when I was 19, I self-published a really shitty novel. Um, I started writing when I was in 4th grade, so I don't remember exactly how old I was. I want to say about 9 years old, or maybe I was. Hold on, I don't remember. But I'm gonna ballpark it at about 9 years old. Um, and I was not a good writer. If you look at the stuff that I was writing when I was 9 years old, it's total drivel because I was 9 years old. What's your ultimate plan for Cult of the Maw? You might have to clarify a bit on what you mean by ultimate plan. Do you mean like, are you asking me what the ending is going to be? Because I'm not going to tell you that. Or are you asking me what my plan is for the series? Um, and for the series itself, the plan is to just run through it with you guys, making a lot of the big decisions for our characters. And based on the decisions you make, that'll kind of dictate how the history of the world moves forward from there. But if you're asking if Cult of the Maw is going to be the end-all, be-all of this, I almost want to call it a franchise, then the answer is no. Yes. Okay, books online. So Cult of the Maw, for now, it's all online. I might transcribe it into books later on, because I don't want it to be in a purely just on YouTube, because I don't know if YouTube is going to last forever, and I want this thing I've created to last if possible. I would really like for it to persist and to be remembered after I'm dead and gone. So I probably will get it all transcribed as books, but the thing that makes it so special as an audio drama and as a series that you guys interact with is the fact that so much of it is kind of a coin toss for me. I have a lot of different variables in play. In fact, I think I mentioned this in a community post, but if you guys had made the opposite decision to what you did back in the very first chapter, if you guys had chosen to let Rai stay down in the mines and try and fight, then Rai would be dead, and we would have one less player character to work with for the rest of the entire story. So I'm glad you didn't let that happen. But I had planned for the eventuality that Rai would be dead from the get-go. There's a lot to think about, and you can't have that kind of story just in a written book. So that was part of why I wanted to make Cult of the Maw an interactive series, was because I wanted there to be this audience participation, this sense that, I know you chose for him to stay, I remember your comment, but you were outvoted, fortunately for Rai, because if everyone had decided that he should stay, he would absolutely have died. Instead, he just lost an eye. But there are other consequences as well. Yes, he survived and he lost an eye, but there are other factors. Rai will not be the same character because of his decision, because of what he's experienced. There's a lot of fear and a lot of trauma based on what he saw down there, what happened to him down there, and it's going to affect him going forward in the narrative, and it's going to affect his relationships with the other characters. So that's the sort of thing that I think makes Cult of the Maw special in its current format. But yes, I do think I'd like to get it all written down after the series is finished as a proper book, or even a set of books, so that it can be read and enjoyed by other people. But that's not the only wow, I'm blanking on my words right now. That's not the only thing that I intend to publish or to make public. I said before earlier on in the stream that I also have plans to um, make the story of the Iron Hand more widely accessible, and to make that sort of a mainstay. I mentioned earlier that I didn't want to spoil the Iron Hand's story in all of its details for you guys, and the reason is because, like I said, I've been writing the Iron Hand story out in a more typical novel fashion, where there is no audience participation because it's all set in stone. And I want to share that with you guys, but I can't yet. I want to let us get, further along in Cult of the Maw as a story, further along into the world, further into further immersed into everything that this series is. And then once I've done that, then I will probably publish and release Iron Hand, or just, World Carver Iron Hand, as its own standalone book, where you will learn more about the Iron Hand, more about the Second Age, more about the Second War of Wrath. All of that stuff that we've been going over in the stream today, you will be able to go over in a lot more detail with the Iron Hand book, which I want to release later on. But I haven't finished writing it yet. I've planned it all out, but I haven't actually written it. So that's one thing that I need to do. I also that poem that I was talking about, the Last March of Goblins. I'm not talking a poem like a couple stanzas worth. I'm talking about a Homeric kind of poem, like the Odyssey or Dante's Inferno, that kind of poem, where we're talking about a very, very lengthy story, but written in iambic pentameter. So that's something else that I would also like to release, possibly in book format. Obviously, it would be quite short compared to the other, compared to Cult of the Maw or to Iron Hand, but that was still something that I would like to make available. And very, very far down the line, if once I've finished all of that, there is one last story. If Rai did end up staying, would you have ended up spending the time to write his last moments with Tyr Ungol? Yes. So, and this is something that will happen at every point in terms of character death in this series, because there are lots of points further ahead where you guys are probably, well, I shouldn't say probably, where it is possible for you guys to end up killing characters. That is 100% something that will most likely happen. I just don't think it's fair for me to assume you guys are always going to make the choices that result in characters surviving. I do think before the end of Cult of the Maw, there are going to be some character deaths, and when that happens, yes, I will write in the last moments of those characters, because A, I want there to be consequences for your decisions, and B, you know, I don't want to have to just say, oh yeah, and then that character died, out of the context of the story. So, yes, if and when characters die later on, you will know about it, and you will know about it in all of its grisly detail. Obviously, because I love these characters, I hope that it is a good long while before that happens, but you never know. I mean, we could have another character death next week. Probably not, but it could happen. Yeah, so I hope you guys sort of have a better idea of both the world that we're in, as well as how we're moving forward, or how I'm moving forward with the storyline of Cult of the Maw and the rest of the World Carver universe, and all the stories I'd like to tell in it. And like I said at the very, very beginning of the stream, it is my hope and my dream that, when all is said and done, and this whole thing is at its end, that more aspiring writers and more people decide to try their own hand at writing a story in this universe. If you look at other major fantasy franchises or major works, if you look at stuff like Dune or Warhammer 40K or Lord of the Rings or World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy, that there's all these big major fantasy franchises that they get their own side stories written by either guest authors or, you know, fans, right? Like, people write fan fiction about this sort of stuff, and as cringy as some of that can be, I would encourage it. How much has Fear and Hunger influenced the story? Um, Not a lot, I have to be honest, because uh, I had already written most of it before Fear and Hunger came out. Or actually, that's not fair to say. Before I had discovered Fear and Hunger. I discovered Fear and Hunger last year, in 2023, and most of Cult of the Maw's world building and writing was done in 2021 and 2022. So that was before I had discovered Fear and Hunger. So I wouldn't say it has a massive amount of influence. But there is one very specific character whose name has quite a bit of Fear and Hunger influence. It's actually a bit of a Fear and Hunger reference, this one character's name. Yes, we've been cooking for a very long time. This has been in the works for a long while. In fact, I believe back in 2020 I was teasing it. Um, and that was before I even had anything to tease. But I was teasing it in my videos. I was creating little ciphers and little puzzles for people to solve. That was teasing the idea that Cult of the Maw was cooking and that it was in production. So that's why when I first announced that it was finally happening, I was so excited to share it with you guys. Um, it's just it like I talked a little bit earlier about the crummy novel that I wrote when I was 19. Um, I'm I'm embarrassed to say that I wrote that. There is one physical copy that exists in the world that I had printed, and it is sitting on my coffee table. Um, it is not a good book. You know, there was so much uh, retconning that I did with it, and so much bad pacing and bad dialogue and flat two-dimensional characters. It was not a good piece of writing, but to my credit, you know, I was a 19-year-old kid, and I am still glad that I wrote something. Um, but even at the time, oh, I got caught by the crab. Even at the time, you know, when I was writing that crummy novel, I was nervous about it, and I didn't feel particularly proud of it because I kept thinking there's so much I could be doing better with this. Cult of the Maw and this entire World Carver universe, this is the first thing I've written and shared with the world that I feel no sort of trepidation about. My crappy novel that I wrote at 19, even like right when I finished writing it and I was so proud of it, there was this prevailing sense of like, I don't know if this is actually any good. I'm proud that I did it, and I'm proud that it's like written and finished, but I don't know if it's any good. This Cult of the Maw and the Iron Hand story and the World Carver universe, I am legitimately very proud of it, and I'm excited to share it. I'm not really afraid of criticism. Something that I was always afraid of with sharing my writing when I was growing up was criticism. This is the first thing that I've written that I don't feel afraid of it receiving criticism. In fact, I hope that it actually does receive some um, constructive, helpful criticism to help me develop as a writer and to become, um, you know, a better writer than I am right now, so I can create even better work as I get older. You know, I'm in my 20s right now, and I expect by the time Cult of the Maw and all the rest of this stuff is finished, I'll probably be in my late 30s. I expect this to be something I'm going to be working over the next 10 years of my life. And I'm excited to see what sort of other projects I will move on to after Cult of the Maw and Iron Hand and Last March of Goblins, and all of this stuff is kind of finished. I don't know if I will create any more fiction that takes place in this universe. I don't have anything else planned after Cult of the Maw is finished. That's as far along in, you know, the timeline of this world that I've thought of. But you know, a lot can happen during the course of this series. So I am really excited to move forward with it, and I can't wait to share all of this stuff with you guys and to really build um, this fiction into something bigger than just, a series on YouTube. I really want it to be as special to all of you as it has become for me. When I first started writing it, back in 2020, it was just something to write because I was bored. I didn't even have this idea at the time of sharing it. It was only in 2021 that I started getting the idea of, putting these ideas together and combining all of these concepts into one cohesive universe. It was essentially a series of short stories that I then kind of started merging into one narrative. So, yeah, I don't really. I think that's probably the longest, most drawn out answer that I could have possibly given to that question, and wholly unnecessarily long. But I hope that answered the question to the best of my ability. Um, I will take any other questions there are at the moment, but if there are not any other questions, I will probably call it here. I think we've covered a lot of ground over the past just under 2 hours. Um, I'm quite happy with the explanations that we've given so far. I hope more people will listen to this after the fact and learn more about Cult of the Maw and about the World Carver universe and all the work that's gone into it moving forward. A lot of the time when I do streams like this, more people tend to catch them after they're already finished and listen to them later on. So I really do hope that um, that's what happens here, and that more people get exposed to both Cult of the Maw as a series, that more people are willing to listen um, and to engage with it, because that would be such a dream come true for me. For people to enjoy it, like I think one of the biggest things for me as a writer that would make me happy is just to know that the things I'm writing are being seen. Um, Whether or not they're being enjoyed, that's up to the audience, that's up to you guys, whether or not you enjoy it. But just to know that it's being seen is, I think, a big part of the dream for so many writers, not just me. Um, I think that's a big part of why we all want to share our writing and why we want to share our creative efforts is, um, and this might come off as very shallow, but it's, at least for me, it's true. Like I want people to listen to this series and to get attached to these characters the same way that I am, uh, because it means so much to me, and I want to create something that means a lot to all of you as well. But I think I have not received any more questions, so I think we're gonna call it. I think that we can call it that a stream. I think that that's about as far as we're gonna be going tonight. But um, if you do have any other questions, leave a comment. On one of the Cult of the Maw videos. I expect to be finished and ready to get our next chapter of Cult of the Maw up. Um, I was planning for it to be up tomorrow, but it's not quite ready. So hopefully a little bit later this week. That will be the first chapter from our next player character's point of view, Piero the Half-Troll, if any of you remember. I like Piero. I think he's going to be a bit refreshing, because so far all of our point of view characters have been nobles and, people who are very in the know about what's going on in the world. We had a member of the King's Lance, we had the King's Royal Vizier, we had Princess Consort Colette, but Piero is a commoner. He's just a guy, and furthermore, he is the only member of our staff. What am I talking about? Our cast so far to be of troll descendancy. He's called the half-troll for a reason. He is literally half Dwero and half troll. And don't think too hard about how that particular union went down. That's not important. The fact is, he is our next character. And I'm really excited to introduce you guys to him. I think you're going to like him. I hope you guys like him. I've tried to write him to be likable and relatable, but if I've failed in that regard, maybe we can do better moving forwards. In any case, this has been a lot of fun for me, just being able to share my writing and this universe with all of you. It's been a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you guys for showing up and for asking your questions. Uh, Once we're a little further along in the series, I'll do another one of these streams, possibly once we have a bit of a larger audience. Um, and we can focus a bit more on the questions and a little bit less on the lore dumping. But in any case, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it, and have a good night. I love you all to bits.